Life of Smoke and Silvered Glass, a Harry Potter fanfiction written by E.Jade Lomax on Archive of Our Own as Dirge Without Music. Part 3 of 6. Read by Grant Goodwin. Severus was waiting for it, and then it came. "Guess what?" said Bellatrix, draping herself over the counter like she was some kind of hanging moss with too great an affinity for eye makeup. "You and Crabbe are eloping," Severus said. He didn't look up from the sleeping draught he was brewing in Avery's kitchen. There was a meeting tonight, and he'd promised Goyle some potions for his kid, who was having trouble sleeping through nights. Bella cackled, swinging a foot at him but missing. "Rodolphus might kill you for that." "I can take Lestrange," said Severus. "Hand me the newt's eyes there." She slid it along the counter to him, almost knocking some of his papers off the edge. When he glared at her, Bella giggled triumphantly, and he fished out a newt's eye. She said, "The Potter's secret keeper squealed." "No," he thought. "Oh God," he thought. "Oh God, it's Lily and James." The newt's eye disappeared into the thick liquid with a plop. Bella stretched up to rifle through Avery's cabinets, looking for something to eat, or fiddle with, or steal, snickering. The potion was grey sludge. Severus's whole body was static. "Do you know what he said?" She shrugged, one cheek stuffed with a marshmallow. "The Dark Lord went himself." "You don't know where?" "You don't ask the Dark Lord." "Excuse me, Bella," he said. Avery asked things. Avery couldn't keep his mouth shut, and while Voldemort crucioed him for it half the time, the other half he answered his questions, because Avery was rather more useful when he knew things, despite all appearances. Severus thudded up the stairs to where Avery was sitting in a sunbeam. "Where did the Dark Lord go? Did he tell you?" said Severus. Avery quickly stuffed his trashy romance novel under his thigh. The cover, which bore a swooning witch in half-open robes, creased, and Avery made a small, sad sound. "Avery," said Severus, "this is urgent. I cannot explain how bad it's going to be if you don't tell me where he's gone, right now." Avery stared at him. "I don't think I've ever heard you say that many words." "Avery!" "Godric's Hollow," he said, and the crack of Severus apparating away cut off the end of the second word. There was smoke rising from the house. If he had come here a week before, he wouldn't even have been able to see it. This brick and wood little home, the massive hedge rising up over the back fence, the bare branches of the tree out front. But someone had betrayed the Potters. Someone had burned up their safety, broken a promise, doomed their friends. One day, Severus was going to kill Sirius Black for this. Severus hit the front door at a run. It was hanging open, the night air billowing in. He didn't have time to look close, but he wasn't sure the whole top of the house was there anymore. A wail thudded down the stairs, deafening even to Severus's ears, which were filling with desperation and static and rage. He'd never been here before, and he'd never be back. There was a ragdoll rabbit on the hideous living room rug. Lily had recited all the wedding gifts to Severus over the radio, and this rug had been from Sirius, an ugly thing he'd meant as a joke, and that James and Lily had kept just to spite him. There was a body on the hideous rug. Severus had seen a lot of bodies on a lot of floors. This one had messy dark hair peeking out from under a green knit hat. Severus took the stairs 3 at a time. He had his wand out. He was hoping he would need it, that this would be a firefight, that there was still something here for him to fight, to do, to leap in front of, but he didn't. Severus stopped in the door of the nursery and clung to the frame to stay standing. There was no sign of Tom Riddle. There were no ghostly fingers slipping over his temples, just a screaming storm that shook through his whole skull. Lily was on the floor, under the torn-apart roof, the billowing night wind. Harry was crying, little chubby fists around the wood of his crib, and he was the only living thing here. It was the first time Severus had ever seen him. He looked like James, even tiny and red-faced and bawling. He had his same dumb mop of hair. Severus stepped into the room, onto the faint purple carpet, much lovelier than the one downstairs, past a painted shelf of little books and toys, past a crumpled quilt on the floor, past Lily. His chest was thudding in and out. He wondered if it was going to injure anything, lungs or muscles or his curving ribs, the way he was shaking and shuddering, his heart something violent, his hands something weak. "Hey," he said. "Hey, kiddo, it's okay." Harry was not very convinced, but to be fair, neither was Severus. Lily was on the floor. He reached slow hands down to wrap around Harry's tiny soft baby ribs and lift him up. He tried to remember how you were supposed to hold babies. Harry was too big to need his head supported, right? He seemed to have that down. Lily's nightdress was being tugged about by the wind, her gauzy sleeves dragging over her wrists. Harry didn't stop crying, but he grabbed at Severus's robes with those tiny, chubby hands, and shuddered there in Severus's careful, shaking hands. "I got you," Severus said, and his voice was terrible, steady and small, and cracked only around the edges. "Lily, I got him. I'm sorry, but we can't stay here." He wrapped one long-fingered hand around the back of Harry's still soft skull, and with a crack, the Godric's Hollow house stood empty. When Severus got back to his apartment, he took 2 intermediary apparitions to confuse any trackers. He threw every lock he had on the door, and pulled up every shielding spell he'd ever worked into the walls. He laid Harry down in the center of the bed. Harry had found the first apparition terrible, and shrieked about it, but he'd found the next 2 to be fairly captivating if nothing else, and had quieted down, and watched him anxiously while he tied a note to the tawny owl's leg and sent her off to Dumbledore. The owl beat her wings against the cold night air and lifted away. Severus moved back to the bed, close enough to catch Harry if it looked like he might roll off. Harry tried to put one of his own toes in his mouth. Severus stared at him, tiny and breathing, alive. The kid's cheeks were damp, so Severus rummaged around for a clean handkerchief and wiped them off. "Oh," said Severus. He sat heavily on the bed. "You've got your mum's eyes." "Pa," said Harry, muffled by some delicious toes. "Pa," Severus agreed, and offered him a finger to chew on. There was a sharp knock at the door. Severus had the anti-apparition spells over his room warded against everyone except himself. Severus scooped Harry up in one arm, and drew his wand with the other to spell the door open, and then to defend against whatever came through it. "You have the child?" said Dumbledore. He bustled past Severus into the room, shutting and locking the door behind him. 1, 2, 3 bolts slotting into place. "Thank Merlin." "Is it actually you?" said Severus. Harry burbled wetly into the shoulder of his robe. "Albus, Lily and James, they're dead." Dumbledore took Severus's shoulder gently. "It is me." His eyes twinkled behind crescent moon glasses. "Confetti cake remains my favorite ice cream flavor." He leaned forward, peering at Harry, who reached up for his glinting glasses. "What is this?" Dumbledore moved to brush his thumb over the jagged scar on Harry's forehead. Severus stared at it. "That's a scar, not a wound," said Severus, taking a step back. "He's not bleeding. It's healed over. He must have fallen sometime." "No," said Dumbledore. "He got this tonight." "Where are you going to take him?" "To his family. He has an aunt and an uncle and a cousin. Muggles." Severus nodded, staring at his stained rug. "Good. Petunia can do something useful for once in her life," he said, in a rush of sound. Harry was warm on his chest, sweet-smelling and heavier than it seemed like he should be. "Severus?" said Dumbledore, and it was soft. "They're dead," he said, and his voice still wasn't right. He shouldn't be able to say those words and not choke on them. He moved back toward the bed, leaning down to put Harry carefully in its center. "I can't. I don't know how." "Severus," said Dumbledore gently, "I realize Lily is gone, but this fight still needs you." Severus lifted his head and looked at him, still bent over the bedspread. There were words bubbling in his throat, hot and thick, but he clung to a silent pause with 2 white-knuckled hands. He took a long breath, straightening up. "This child is going to need you," said Dumbledore, and Severus decided he'd probably paused enough now. "You think you have to convince me," said Severus. He put one word down after the other, like he was laying a path to someplace. Heavy stones dropped onto the earth. Harry made a little sound on the bed, and tried to get his toes in his mouth again. "After all of this, after everything, you think because they murdered the most important person in my entire world, I'm going to jump ship now. Now!" "Severus." "Do you understand what I have done for this fight?" said Severus. "For them? For you? Do you understand what I have bled, and what I have cut away? I would have died for them. I have been dying for them." "This won't be the end of it," said Dumbledore, like he was a wise old sage, and not an old man who loved socks and hated straight answers and trusted no one. That was the thing about Albus. Severus would learn. He knew it even now, but he would learn and learn. Albus didn't trust anyone, and he trusted himself least of all. And their child. He must be protected. He will need to be protected. Severus, you must listen to me before you do anything rash." "You think you have to twist this for me, to make me stay?" Severus shook his head, taking a wobbling step back, skewing his face with scorn he'd been perfecting for years. Albus, I'm flattered I mean so much to you, but put a sock in it. I got this twisted up enough for myself. Your pretty words were never why I was here. But Lily was. Albus looked stricken even as he said it. And now? I'm sorry, this isn't the right time for this conversation. It will never be the right time for this conversation. Please take the baby. Please go. I will contact you when I have something new to report. His name is Harry. I know his name, said Severus. Get out. He checked the locks on the door after Dumbledore left. He opened the window for the owl. He lay down on his bed and looked at the mould creeping across the ceiling. This still isn't goodbye, Lily had said. Severus reached out and flipped on the radio, and laid there in the dark until dawn, listening to the crackle of empty airwaves. In the morning they told him the war was over. He hadn't realized. In retrospect, that made sense, but he hadn't seen Riddle's body. He watched people stumble in the streets, happy and hungover, and thought that they were right, that the most important thing that had happened the night before was the end of a war. But he sat in the quiet of his room. The ice cream shop was closed, like it was a holiday, and maybe it would become one, and he couldn't get himself to believe that. He hadn't seen Riddle's body, though, so when Avery came knocking at his door the next afternoon, he let him in like a friend. You knew, said Avery. Severus poured hot water into a chipped mug. He put the kettle down and fished out a tea bag, and then he spoke. Avery didn't even blink at the silence, because this was Snape, and they'd all agreed a while back that he was a bit of a weird bloke. I'd only just figured it out, said Severus. I still don't quite know what they did. You were trying to warn him, whatever weapon those cowards had. They weren't cowards, Severus snapped, and then he tried to bury it back down into his throat. He stirred his tea and handed the other mug to Avery. How dare you call someone with the courage to face against our Lord coward? Fools, maybe. Avery snorted. They're saying it was the baby, but clearly that's nonsense. Said Severus. What are we going to do now? Grovel, said Severus. Apologize. Lie. They hadn't found Riddle's body after all. They had found no ugly husk of Voldemort's. Severus was having a hard time calling this a victory, and one of the reasons was because he wasn't sure they'd won. He didn't tell Avery that part, just sent him away and went back to bed. His untouched tea cooled on the counter for a few days before he finally poured it down the sink. 15 minutes of patient knocking woke him up at 3 p.m. on a disgustingly bright Tuesday. I've burnt no covers, said Severus into his pillow, after he'd fished his wand out from under it and waved open the locks on the door. My fucking evil cult leader just turned to smoke. I'm in mourning. Leave me alone, Albus. I've vouched for you with the ministry, said Dumbledore. You've been pardoned. He threw open the curtains, letting a beam of angry daylight in. Severus sat up, resigned, but he pulled his blankets around his shoulders mutinously. So you're burning my covers, then? When he returns, you will give him information on me and on the Order, and you will be more valuable than ever. And in the meantime, you won't rot in Azkaban. Hurrah, said Severus, and then, when? Not if, but when, you think? I fear so, said Albus. I know something of what dark magics Tom played with. I do not think he can be dead. Not yet. Lovely, said Severus. Albus sat on the edge of the bed, so Severus rolled out of it and stumped over to the sink to splash some water on his face. My potions master resigned, Albus said. Good riddance, said Severus. He couldn't teach his way out of a game of children's checkers. I'd like to hire you for the position, said Albus. Can't do it. I'd miss the ice cream, said Severus. Those rainbow sprinkles are the only bright spot in my life. When, said Albus, and not if he comes back. He will come for Hogwarts. You know this. Obsessive, nostalgic creeper, Severus agreed reluctantly. He will come for Harry, said Albus. I want you there. I need your help, Severus. God, all right, said Severus. I don't have to start tomorrow, do I? No, said Albus, but please consider it. I think it will be good for you. They put up a statue in Godric's Hollow. Severus didn't go to see it. Instead, he apparated out to a wide fenced-in green hill near Sussex, and walked among the gravestones, quiet, until he found the ones he was looking for. He hadn't been here since he'd been 15 years old, holding Lily's hand, sweating through one of his father's old, ill-fitting suits. Lily's grave is a tourist attraction nearly, he told the patch of greening earth at his feet. I'd be seen, and I can't answer those questions. Hi, Mr. Evans. Hi, Mrs. Evans. Sorry. The sky was blue and breakable, and that was absurd because Lily was dead. Lily was dead, and there should be no sunlight left. A bird sang prettily from the bushes, and a squirrel dashed down the row of graves, tail high and bushy. Absurdity. He'd be angry if he wasn't so tired. Bellatrix and her husband went to Azkaban. Barty Crouch Jr. vanished somewhere, and Severus didn't pay attention to it. The papers rolled out lists of arrests and pardons and speculation, but Severus had been anxiously scanning the headlines for months, and he was a bit done with that. Karkaroff dropped desperate confessions and information at the ministry's feet, and then left the country with their grudging blessing. Lucius Malfoy asked Severus over for tea, and when he arrived in Lucius's second-best sitting room, there was a bulky, unmarked package on the tea table. "No," said Severus, and he almost laughed at how easy it was to say it. He slid into a seat and took a scone. "I'm not your mule, Lucius." Lucius's face twisted. Severus resisted the urge to put his boots up on the pale peach chair cushion opposite him and smear black dirt all over them. "You were the Dark Lord's," said Lucius, jumping up at every snap of his fingers. "You're no Voldemort," said Severus, and Lucius, even now, flinched at the name. "And I hear you weren't even a Death Eater these days." "I hear you're an older spy these days." Severus snorted. "If you believed that, I wouldn't be here. I'm a spy as much as you're an imperioed innocent. Just trying to survive a defeat is all. You understand." He brushed crumbs off his robe and snatched up another scone. "These are quite good," he said. "Say hello to Narcissa for me, and smuggle your own damn packages." "Don't you want a window?" Albus asked after Severus had turned down a few nice tower or ground-room floors and headed straight down the dungeons. He'd found the potions lab and then taken a few turns to find some nested empty storage rooms. "These will do," he'd said, and started scouring them out. "Not really," said Severus, surveying the room for the proper place to put a workbench. He'd have to install some ventilation spells to whisk away the more toxic gases, but he had a dozen of those tucked under his tongue. "Minerva has a full floor of one of the towers," said Albus. "Professor Sprout built herself a half-buried cottage out on the grounds. All the students just think it's a pretty bush. We don't lack for space here. Severus, it is a magical castle." "You know, I've been here before, actually," said Severus. "I'll take these two, thanks. You said you wanted me to start classes tomorrow?" He conjured a sturdy workbench, a set of knives, and a cauldron from the class stores down the hall, and set them up in the best corner. "You can brew in the classrooms or the labs," Albus said. "Severus, there are plenty of available facilities." "I'm sort of in the habit of being self-contained," Severus said. He set up the first room into an office, and the second, whose only entrance was through the first, into a bedroom. He thought the lack of windows would discourage her, but the tawny owl pecked patiently at his door until he let her inside to roost. "There's an owlery," he told her. "I'm told it's very nice." She hooted disapprovingly at him, and treaded the corner of the stack of old potions assignments he'd been reviewing. The previous professor, he saw, had still been teaching Goinger's brewing methodologies, even though Rolf et al. Had thoroughly debunked those in the 1940s. Severus pulled the pile out of her reach. "I should probably name you," he said. She fluffed up her neck feathers and ducked her head under her wing to nibble away some dirt there. "You look like an Agatha," he said, and she didn't seem to take offense, so that's what he called her. Not all of the teachers had known him before, but Minerva McGonagall had. She made it clear she was only tolerating his presence out of respect for Dumbledore's wishes. His owl hissed angrily whenever McGonagall glanced balefully his way at the breakfast table, which he didn't really think was warranted, but he unwillingly appreciated it anyway, though he did wonder if owls normally hissed. Agatha preened primly, stole a triangle of toast, and took off with a massive flap of her wings. He set the kids to brew a grade-appropriate potion first, just to see where they were at. Where they were at was terrible. He spent the rest of the year trying to drag them up to standard. "Do you really want me teaching children, Albus?" he asked one late night. Outside the wide windows of the headmaster's office, he could see all the way to the forbidden forest. "I know few people who understand potions as well as you, Professor." Albus beamed when Severus's nose twisted at the title. Severus snorted. "Knowing the subject isn't teaching. I am not patient. I am not kind." "Neither is Minerva," Dumbledore hesitated. "And you cannot be kind," he said. "You do have a reputation to maintain." "Don't worry about it," Severus said. I'm using you as an excuse. When a bunch of pure-blooded parents come running to you demanding your head on a platter for meddling, please know who sent them. When little Slytherin children whose terrible relations Severus knew a bit too well came to him and complained he was favouring Hufflepuffs, he wasn't. He was favouring people who did their goddamn homework. He looked aggrieved and regretful and bitter and complained about Albus Dumbledore and his nosy administration. Look for who has the power, kids, he said. Look for who's using it, and then you survive whatever world you find yourself in. For the first 2 years he talked to the book. It was adequate, even if adequacy generally made Severus curl his lip in disgust. Once he got a decent, white-knuckled grip on the basic curriculum, running a classroom was nothing to navigating a meeting of Death Eaters, except for how it was about 1,000,000,000 times harder. He started folding in his own methods and recipes. He tutored any student who requested it, but few did, so he approached the ones he thought would get the most out of it, the most talented, but also the ones who seemed to love it most, and the ones trailing far behind, who he just couldn't reach in class. He made sure to scowl through all of it. He complained to his Slytherin students that the headmaster forbade him to favour only one house in his choices for private tutoring. If I had my way, he assured the sons and daughters and nieces and nephews of Death Eaters, and they nodded sagely. The first time Nymphadora Tonks brewed a perfect sleeping draught, he had to feign a coughing attack to hide the smile. Acceptable, Miss Tonks, he told her, and she rolled her eyes and grabbed her bag and left for lunch with her friends. 3 years later, Severus found an unsealed envelope on his desk, with his name in Albus's fluid hand on the front. Inside were the Auror exam results of Tonks, Nymphadora, who had failed stealth, but aced both disguises and potions. The first time Nymphadora had stepped into Severus's classroom, her hair had been bright blue, but her nose had been the one she'd been born with, and her chin and her smirk too. Severus had almost jumped to his feet. He almost grabbed his wand, but instead he just sat there and clung to stillness. Bellatrix had been in Azkaban for years. When he had tripped over his tongue and told Nymphadora she looked like her aunt, she had cast him a disgusted glance and told him she looked like herself. Halloween came around every year, and Severus sat through the feast drinking pumpkin juice and feeding Agatha. When Agatha visited him at meals, the other professors made sure to give him enough elbow room to accommodate her entire wingspan, and she always visited him on Halloween. He found this to be very acceptable. His birthday was in January, and so was Lily's. Everything frosted over for miles, and Severus woke up in the winter mornings with cold toes. Severus turned 22, 23, 24, 25, and Lily stayed 21 and dead. The sun went down in January, but you couldn't tell from his sunless rooms, except from the way his fingers and toes ached if he didn't light a fire or cast a warming spell. He often didn't. She's dead, he thought. She's dead and you're alive. Be alive. He went up to the kitchens and got some hot cocoa from the house elves. It never got cold. He never got warm. He went to bed. The second time Severus ever saw Harry, the kid was stepping through the great hall doors in a crowd of tiny first years. They got smaller every year, Severus swore. Harry wasn't saying anything to the first years talking beside him, his head tipped back to look at the ceiling sky. He looked even more like James than he had the last time Severus had seen him, which made sense because now he could walk, and presumably talk, and likely didn't chew on his toes so much. End of part 3 of 6. This has been a reading of a fan fiction creation by E.Jade Lomax with music by Maiden.